The winter wind cut through Clearwater Station like a knife through butter, carrying with it the promise of a brutal Montana night. It was the last week of January, 1892, and Grace Whitmore stood alone on the wooden platform, her navy traveling dress offering little protection against the cold that crept up from the frozen ground beneath her feet. The afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Grace had no eye for beauty. She had been waiting for 6 hours, and the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. No one was coming for her. The station master emerged from his small office, pulling his coat tighter around his substantial frame. He cast a glance at Grace, and she saw pity flicker across his weathered features before he looked away. That look told her everything she needed to know. She was not the first mail-order bride to be abandoned at this desolate outpost, and she would not be the last. Grace shifted her weight, wincing as familiar pain shot through her left leg. The limp had been with her since childhood, a permanent reminder of the fever that had nearly claimed her life at age 7. In Philadelphia society, it had marked her as damaged goods unsuitable for marriage despite her education and her skill with numbers. Her mother had made that clear enough over the years with her tight-lipped silences and disapproving sighs whenever Grace entered a room. The single trunk beside her contained everything she owned in this world. 3 dresses, 2 practical, and 1 for Sundays. A worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. The silver-handled hairbrush her father had given her on her 16th birthday before the factory closure had stolen his health and eventually his life. And wrapped carefully in muslin cloth, the small leather journal where she had copied every letter William Harper had sent her over the past 7 months. William Harper. The name felt hollow now, like an echo in an empty room. Grace reached into her reticule and counted the coins there for perhaps the 20th time that day. $18.43. It was all that remained from the sale of her mother's silver mirror, the only item of value she had possessed. The mirror had been a gift from Grace's father during happier times, but her mother had relinquished it without sentiment when Grace announced her intention to travel west as a mail-order bride. "You are making your own bed," her mother had said. "Do not expect to come crying back to me when you discover the truth about these frontier men." The temperature was dropping rapidly now, the way it did in the mountains when the sun began its descent. Grace could see her breath misting in the air before her face. The station master approached again, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "Miss, we close the station at sunset. That is in about 40 minutes. I cannot let you stay inside overnight." Grace straightened her spine, summoning what remained of her dignity. "I understand. Is there lodging nearby where I might secure a room? The nearest boarding house is 3 miles into town." He hesitated clearly, struggling with whether to say more. "Look, miss, I do not mean to pry, but were you expecting to meet someone here? Because if you were supposed to be met by William Harper, well, I am afraid there has been a terrible misunderstanding." Grace felt her heart constrict. "You know Mr. Harper knew him, miss." The station master removed his cap and twisted it between his hands. "I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, but William Harper died near about 3 weeks ago. Thrown from his horse while checking fence lines, broke his neck. The funeral was 2 weeks back." The words seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the roaring in Grace's ears. Dead. William Harper was dead. The man whose letters had been her lifeline during the darkest months after her father's passing. The man who had described his ranch in such loving detail, who had shared his dreams of building something lasting in this wild territory. The man who had never once, in 7 months of correspondence, failed to respond to her letters. Until now. "I see," Grace heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Thank you for informing me." The station master shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Do you have family back east, miss? Someone who could send you money for the return journey?" Grace thought of her mother, remarried now, to a hardware merchant with 3 grown sons. There would be no welcome there, no room in that new household for a spinster daughter who had failed at even the desperate measure of becoming a mail-order bride. Her 2 younger sisters had made successful marriages to respectable Philadelphia men and would be mortified by Grace's current circumstances. "I will manage," she said quietly. The station master nodded, clearly relieved to be absolved of further responsibility. He retreated to his office, leaving Grace alone with the knowledge that darkness was coming and she had nowhere to go. She sat down carefully on her trunk, arranging her skirts to cover her legs. The platform was deserted now, save for herself. The few other passengers who had disembarked that morning had been met by family or friends and whisked away to whatever lives awaited them in this harsh land. Only Grace remained a piece of unwanted baggage left behind. The irony was not lost on her. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to escape being a burden, only to find herself in an even more precarious position than before. At least in Philadelphia, she had known the streets, had understood the unspoken rules of society. Here she knew nothing and no one. Grace opened her reticule again and withdrew the most recent letter from William Harper, dated 5 weeks earlier. His handwriting was bold and clear, the letters formed with care by a hand more accustomed to manual labor than correspondence. "Dear Miss Whitmore," the letter began. "Your last inquiry about the winter preparations here brought a smile to my face. You asked about provisions and planning with the practical mind I have come to admire through our correspondence. I am pleased to report that the harvest was good this year. The cellar is stocked, and I have laid in supplies sufficient to see us through even the harshest season. I confess I find myself thinking often of your arrival. The house seems too quiet now, too empty for a man alone. I have spent the past weeks making preparations for your comfort. The front parlor has been painted in the shade of blue you mentioned, preferring reminiscent of the morning sky before the sun rises fully. I have ordered a proper dressing table from Denver, as I recall you writing about missing the one you had in Philadelphia." The letter continued in this vein for another page, describing the ranch, the small community of Clearwater, his hopes for their life together. Grace had read it so many times she could recite passages from memory. And now the man who had written these words was dead, buried in frozen ground, while she traveled toward him in ignorant hope. The sun touched the horizon, and the temperature plummeted. Grace stood knowing she could not remain on the platform much longer. She would have to walk into town, find the boarding house the station master had mentioned, and hope that $18 would buy her enough time to formulate some kind of plan. She bent to grasp the handle of her trunk, and pain lanced through her leg. The long hours of standing had aggravated the old injury. She gritted her teeth and tried to lift the trunk, but it was too heavy. All her worldly possessions weighed far more than she could manage, especially with her weakened leg. Grace straightened, fighting back tears of frustration. She refused to cry. Tears solved nothing, changed nothing. She had learned that lesson young, during the long months of recovery from the fever, when her mother had made it clear that self-pity was an indulgence the family could not afford. "Let me help with that." The voice came from behind her, deep and measured. Grace turned to find a man standing at the edge of the platform, leading a bay horse by the reins. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of beard growth. "I can manage," Grace said automatically, though it was obviously untrue. The man moved closer, and in the fading light she could make out his features more clearly. He appeared to be around 34 or 35, with sun-weathered skin and lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. His eyes were a striking pale gray, almost silver in the dying light, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I do not think you can manage. Not with that leg, and not with a trunk that size." He gestured to the abandoned platform. "And you cannot stay here. Temperature will drop below freezing within the hour." Grace lifted her chin. "I am aware of my circumstances, sir. I appreciate your concern, but I am not in need of rescue." The corner of his mouth twitched as if he found this statement amusing. "Is that so?" "It is. Then I suppose it is merely coincidence that you have been standing alone on this platform since the afternoon train arrived 6 hours ago, waiting for someone who is not coming." Heat flooded Grace's cheeks despite the cold. "You have been watching me. I have been in town on business." He tied his horse to the platform railing with practiced ease. "I saw you arrive this morning. I saw you waiting. And I know who you are." Grace's breath caught. "You know who I am?" The man moved closer, and she caught the scent of wood smoke and leather and something else, something clean and distinctly masculine. His gray eyes held hers with an unwavering gaze that was neither threatening nor pitying, but something else entirely. "You are Grace Whitmore from Philadelphia. You came here to marry William Harper." He paused, and something like regret crossed his features. "And I am the one who has been waiting for you, Miss Whitmore, because William Harper asked me to before he died." The words hung in the cold air between them. Grace stared at this stranger, trying to make sense of what he had just said. He knew William. He knew about their arrangement, and he had been waiting for her. "I do not understand," she managed. "I know." The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair that needed cutting and a face that might have been handsome if not for the weariness etched into every line. "My name is Jake Thornton. William Harper was my closest friend. Before he died, he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would look after his mail-order bride if she arrived. He did not want you to be left stranded with nowhere to go." Grace felt the world tilting slightly beneath her feet. This was too much information, too much emotion, to process all at once. "William is truly dead," Jake Thornton nodded slowly. "Died 3 weeks ago. It was quick. He did not suffer. And you have been waiting for me because he asked you to. I gave him my word." Grace looked at this man who claimed friendship with William Harper, trying to determine if he could be trusted. In Philadelphia, a woman alone accepting help from a strange man would be unconscionable. But she was not in Philadelphia anymore, and her choices had narrowed to accepting help or freezing to death on this platform. Jake seemed to sense her hesitation. He gestured toward the small building behind them. "The station master will vouch for me if you need assurance of my character. I own a ranch and business interests in Clearwater. I am not some drifter looking to take advantage." "What kind of business interests?" Jake met her gaze evenly, as if challenging her to judge him. "I own a cattle ranch north of town, and I own the Silver Spur, which is part saloon and part dance hall. It is where most community gatherings take place." Grace absorbed this information. A saloon owner. In Philadelphia, such a man would be considered beyond the pale of respectable society. But this was not Philadelphia, and respectable society had never shown her much kindness anyway. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Thornton?" Jake picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing, muscles flexing beneath his work shirt. "I am proposing to take you to Widow Martinez's boarding house, where you can secure a room for the night. Tomorrow, if you are willing, I will take you to see William's ranch. After that, we can discuss your options. My options, whether you choose to return east or make a life here in Montana." He settled the trunk over his shoulder and turned those pale gray eyes on her again. "But that is a conversation for tomorrow. Right now, you need warmth and food and rest. The rest can wait." Grace studied him for a long moment. There was something solid about Jake Thornton, something that suggested a man who kept his word. And William had trusted him. That had to count for something. "Very well," she said. "I accept your assistance, Mr. Thornton." "Jake." He secured her trunk to his horse with practiced efficiency. "If we are going to know each other, you should call me Jake." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Jake." He offered his arm, and after a moment's consideration, she took it. His forearm was solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt, and he adjusted his stride to accommodate her limp without comment or obvious notice. This small courtesy, so different from the way people in Philadelphia had either stared at her disability or pretended not to notice while making a great show of their discomfort, loosened something tight in Grace's chest. They walked down the platform steps to where his horse waited patiently. Jake untied the reins and began to lead the animal down the rutted road that led into town. Grace walked beside him, acutely aware of how much she was trusting this stranger. "May I ask how you knew William?" she ventured after they had walked in silence for several minutes. "We served together in the Army years back. After our discharge, we both came to Montana looking for land and opportunity. William staked his claim about 10 miles northwest of Clearwater. I settled closer to town." Jake's voice held the careful flatness of someone discussing painful memories. "We helped each other build our places, saw each other through hard winters and harder times. He was the closest thing to a brother I ever had. I am sorry for your loss." Jake glanced at her, and she saw surprise flicker across his features as if he had not expected sympathy. "Thank you." They continued walking as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead. The vast Montana sky was unlike anything Grace had seen in Philadelphia, where buildings blocked the view and coal smoke dimmed the stars. Here the heavens spread out in an endless canopy, beautiful and terrifying in its immensity. "It is different here," she said softly, more to herself than to Jake. "Different than Philadelphia, different than anywhere I have ever been." Jake made a sound that might have been agreement. "You will either love it or hate it. There is not much middle ground when it comes to Montana." Grace thought about this as they walked. The cold was bitter, but it was a clean cold, sharp and honest. The wind carried scents of pine and wood smoke, rather than the garbage and industrial waste that perfumed Philadelphia's streets. And the silence, broken only by their footsteps and the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves, was so profound it almost had weight. After about 20 minutes of walking, they rounded a bend and Clearwater came into view. It was smaller than Grace had imagined, a single main street lined with false-fronted buildings that proclaimed their purposes in bold lettering. She could make out a general store, a church with a modest steeple, what appeared to be a telegraph office, and at the far end of the street a larger two-story structure with light spilling from its windows. "That is the Silver Spur," Jake said, following her gaze. "On Saturday nights it gets lively, but most evenings it is quiet enough." His tone was neutral, neither defensive nor apologetic. "And the boarding house just ahead." Jake guided her toward a neat white-painted building with a small garden in front, now dormant for winter. "Widow Martinez runs a respectable establishment, 75 cents a night, including breakfast, or $1.50 for all meals." Grace did quick mental arithmetic. At that rate, her $18 would last less than 2 weeks, even if she chose only breakfast. The thought was sobering. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. "We can discuss employment possibilities tomorrow, after you have rested." "Employment." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "What kind of employment?" "The kind that uses your skills rather than just your willingness to work hard." He met her gaze steadily. "William told me about you, Miss Whitmore. He mentioned in his letters that you kept books for your father's business, that you had a head for figures and organization. Those are valuable skills here, perhaps more valuable than you realize." Before Grace could respond, the door to the boarding house opened, and a round, gray-haired woman appeared in the doorway. She held a lamp high, peering out into the darkness. "Jake Thornton, is that you?" The woman had a slight accent that Grace could not quite place, something that added a musical lilt to her words. "Evening, Mrs. Martinez." Jake tipped his hat respectfully. "I have brought you a guest in need of a room." The widow descended the porch steps, moving with surprising agility for a woman of her apparent age. She held the lamp higher, studying Grace with sharp dark eyes that missed nothing, including the limp and the travel-stained dress, and the weariness that Grace could feel in every bone. "This is Miss Grace Whitmore from Philadelphia," Jake continued. "She has had a difficult journey and requires lodging." "Philadelphia," Widow Martinez pronounced the word as if tasting it. "You are a long way from home, child." Grace straightened her shoulders. "I am not a child, ma'am. I am 26 years old and quite capable of managing my own affairs." To her surprise, the widow smiled. "Good. I have no patience for helpless women who expect the world to cater to their delicate sensibilities." She gestured toward the house. "Come inside before you freeze. Mr. Thornton, bring her trunk around to the side entrance." "Yes, ma'am." There was a hint of amusement in Jake's voice that made Grace wonder about the relationship between these two. The interior of the boarding house was warm and smelled of bread and stew and clean linen. Widow Martinez led Grace into a small parlor where a fire crackled cheerfully in a stone fireplace. She gestured for Grace to sit in one of the chairs near the hearth. "You will want to warm yourself slowly," the widow advised. "Too much heat too fast after being so cold can be painful." Grace sank into the chair, gratefully feeling warmth begin to seep into her frozen limbs. The widow was right. As sensation returned to her hands and feet, they began to ache fiercely. Jake entered through a side door, having deposited Grace's trunk somewhere out of sight. He removed his hat and stood just inside the doorway, as if uncertain whether to stay or go. "Sit down, Mr. Thornton," Widow Martinez commanded. You look as tired as she does. I will bring coffee." She disappeared through a doorway that presumably led to the kitchen, leaving Grace and Jake alone in the warm parlor. He took the chair opposite hers, stretching his long legs toward the fire. In the lamplight, Grace could see him more clearly. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with creases around his eyes and mouth that suggested both laughter and hardship. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them daily. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, "for coming to the station, for bringing me here." Jake inclined his head slightly. "I told William I would look after you if something happened to him. I do not break my word. Even so, most men would not feel obligated to a stranger. You are not a stranger. William spoke of you often these past months. He showed me your letters." Jake's expression softened slightly. He was happy, Miss Whitmore, happier than I had seen him in years. He was looking forward to your arrival, to building a life with you. The words should have been comforting, but instead they made Grace's throat tighten with grief for a man she had never met. What was he like in person, not just in letters? Jake considered the question. Honest, hard-working. He had his rough edges, as we all do out here, but he was a good man. He treated people fairly, kept his word, looked after those who needed help. He paused. He would have been a good husband to you. Widow Martinez returned with a tray bearing a coffee pot and 3 sturdy mugs. She poured for each of them, adding generous amounts of sugar without asking. Grace wrapped her hands around the warm mug, breathing in the bitter, rich scent. "Now then," the widow settled into a chair. "Suppose you tell me what brings a Philadelphia lady to Montana in the dead of winter." Grace glanced at Jake, who gave a slight nod as if encouraging her to speak. She took a sip of the hot, sweet coffee and felt it warm her all the way down. "I came to marry William Harper. We had been corresponding for 7 months. He sent money for my journey, and I arrived this afternoon expecting to meet him at the station." Grace kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Mr. Thornton informed me that Mr. Harper died 3 weeks ago." The widow made a soft sound of sympathy. "That is a hard blow, child, to come so far only to find your intended gone." "Yes, and now—" "What will you do?" Grace met the older woman's eyes. "I do not yet know. But I will not be returning to Philadelphia. There is nothing for me there." Widow Martinez nodded, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. "Well, you are welcome to stay here as long as you need. We can discuss terms in the morning when you are rested." "Thank you." Jake set down his empty coffee mug and stood. "I should be going. It is late and you need rest, Miss Whitmore." He turned to the widow. "I will return tomorrow morning, if that suits, to take Miss Whitmore out to see William's place." The widow's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that wise? She came here to marry the man. The least I can do is show her what he built, what her life would have been like." Jake's tone was firm but not defensive. "It is her right to see it." Grace stood as well, swaying slightly as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "That is kind of you, Mr. Thornton. Jake, I would like to see the ranch very much." Jake studied her for a long moment, and Grace had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. "Then we will go tomorrow. I will call for you at 9 if that gives you enough time to rest and break your fast." "That will be fine." After Jake left, Widow Martinez showed Grace to a small room on the 2nd floor. It contained a narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, a 3-drawer chest, and a single window overlooking the back garden. The widow had brought Grace's trunk up while she sat by the fire, and it now rested at the foot of the bed. The privy is out back, accessed through the kitchen. Chamber pot is under the bed if you need it during the night. Breakfast is at 7, but I will save you a plate if you prefer to sleep later. The widow paused at the door. "You are safe here, child. Whatever troubles brought you west, you are safe now." After the widow left, Grace sank onto the bed and finally allowed the tears she had been holding back all day to fall. She cried for her father dead these 4 months. She cried for William Harper, a good man she would never know. She cried for herself, stranded 2,000 miles from everything familiar with less than $20 to her name and no clear path forward. But even as she wept, Grace's mind was already working, already calculating and planning. She had $18.43. The boarding house cost 75 cents per night, with breakfast or $1.50 with all meals. If she took only breakfast, she could stretch her funds for nearly 3 weeks, perhaps a month, if she was very careful. She needed employment. Jake Thornton had mentioned her bookkeeping skills, had suggested they might be valuable. What kind of work could he have in mind? Something at his saloon, most likely, though the thought of working in such an establishment made her uneasy. What would the people of Clearwater think of a woman who kept books for a drinking house? But Grace had long since learned that survival mattered more than respectability. If keeping accounts for a saloon owner would earn her a living, then that is what she would do. She rose from the bed and went to the window, looking out at the dark expanse of Montana night. Somewhere out there was William Harper's ranch, the home he had prepared for her, the life they would never share. Tomorrow she would see it. Tomorrow she would begin to understand what might have been, and perhaps find clues to what might yet be possible. Grace turned from the window and began to undress, hanging her travel dress carefully to air out the worst of the wrinkles. She washed her face and hands in the cold water from the pitcher, then plaited her hair for sleeping. The bed was narrow, but the mattress was comfortable, and when she slipped between the sheets, she found them clean and smelling faintly of lavender. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this frontier town, Grace thought about Jake Thornton. He had appeared at the moment of her greatest need, fulfilling a promise to a dead friend. There had been no judgment in his eyes when he looked at her limp, no pity when he learned of her circumstances, just a steady assessment and an offer of practical help. "I know who you are," he had said, "and I have been waiting for you." The words echoed in Grace's mind as sleep began to claim her. Whatever Jake Thornton knew about her from William's letters, he would learn far more in the days to come. Grace had not traveled 2,000 miles to fail. She had not survived her father's death and her mother's rejection and the humiliation of being a spinster, dependent only to give up now. Montana was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where a woman's past mattered less than her capabilities, where her limp might be seen as just another challenge to overcome rather than a mark of shame, where she might finally prove that Grace Whitmore was more than damaged goods unfit for marriage. Tomorrow would bring the ranch, and with it, the first real glimpse of what her life in Montana might become. Grace closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under her last conscious thought, a whisper of determination. "I will not fail. I refuse to fail." Morning came too quickly. Grace woke to the sound of voices drifting up from the floor below, mingling with the clatter of dishes and the rich aroma of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then memory returned with the weight of stones settling in her chest. Montana, Clearwater. William Harper was dead, and she was alone in a strange land with no clear future. She rose from the bed, wincing as her left leg protested the movement. The long journey and yesterday's hours of standing had aggravated the old injury. Grace moved to the washstand and splashed cold water on her face, forcing herself fully awake. In the small mirror above the basin, her reflection showed the toll of recent weeks. Dark circles shadowed her blue eyes, and her face looked thinner than it had when she left Philadelphia. Grace dressed carefully in one of her practical dresses, a gray wool that was serviceable, if not fashionable. She pinned her chestnut hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck and descended the narrow stairs to the dining room. Widow Martinez presided over a long table where 4 other boarders were already eating. They looked up as Grace entered, curiosity evident on every face. The widow made introductions with brisk efficiency. "This is Miss Grace Whitmore from Philadelphia. Miss Whitmore, these are your fellow boarders, Mr. Samuel Chen and Mr. Robert O'Brien, who work at the general store, Miss Alice Patterson, our school teacher, and Mr. Henry Walsh, who manages the telegraph office." Grace nodded to each in turn, taking the empty seat the widow indicated. A plate appeared before her, laden with eggs, bacon-fried potatoes, and thick slices of bread. It was more food than Grace typically ate for breakfast, but her stomach reminded her that she had eaten nothing since a stale roll on the train yesterday morning. "You are the lady who came to marry William Harper." This came from Alice Patterson, a thin woman of perhaps 40, with sharp eyes and sharper features. "I am." Terrible tragedy, that. Miss Patterson did not sound particularly sympathetic. William Harper kept to himself mostly, but he was always civil. paid his accounts on time, attended church when weather permitted. Grace cut into her eggs, keeping her expression neutral. "I am sorry I never had the opportunity to know him. Mr. Thornton said he would take you out to see the ranch today." Robert O'Brien was younger than his colleague, perhaps 25, with red hair and a scattering of freckles across his nose. "That is decent of him, seeing as he has no obligation. Jake Thornton is a man who keeps his word," Widow Martinez said, firmly ending that line of conversation. She refilled Grace's coffee cup. "Eat up, child. You look half-starved, and the ride out to Harper's place will take the better part of 2 hours." Grace ate steadily, aware of the glances being cast her way. She understood what they were thinking. Another desperate Eastern woman seeking a husband in the territories, only to discover the reality was far harsher than the letters had suggested. They were wondering how long she would last before admitting defeat and returning east. Let them wonder. Grace had no intention of providing answers to questions they had not earned the right to ask. She had just finished eating when a knock sounded at the front door. Widow Martinez answered it, and Jake Thornton's deep voice carried into the dining room. "Good morning, Mrs. Martinez. I am here for Miss Whitmore, if she is ready." Grace stood smoothing her skirts. "Thank you for breakfast, Widow Martinez. It was excellent." The widow nodded approvingly. "There is a basket by the door with bread and cheese for your journey. The ride is long, and you will want something to eat." "That is very kind." Grace retrieved her warmest shawl from her room and met Jake at the front door. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his jaw freshly shaved and his dark hair still damp from washing. He wore clean work clothes and a heavy coat against the cold, and he held a second coat over his arm. "The temperature will drop as we climb into the higher elevations," he said, offering her the coat. "This belonged to my sister. She left it behind when she married and moved to Denver. It should fit you well enough." Grace accepted the garment, oddly touched by this practical consideration. "Your sister will not mind. She has 3 coats in Denver and no need of this one." Jake helped her into the coat, which was lined with sheepskin and beautifully warm. "Besides, I suspect she would approve of the use." They walked to where a small buggy waited hitched to the same bay horse from yesterday. Jake handed Grace up onto the seat with careful attention to her weak leg, then climbed up beside her. He collected the reins and clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward at a steady walk. Clearwater looked different in daylight. The buildings that had seemed so stark and utilitarian in the darkness revealed themselves as sturdy and well-maintained. The main street was wide and lined with wooden sidewalks. Grace noted a bank, a doctor's office, a dressmaker's shop, and the general store where her fellow boarders worked. At the far end of town stood the Silver Spur, its 2-story facade freshly painted. "That is your establishment," Grace observed. "It is." Jake's tone was neutral. "We can stop there on the way back if you would like to see it." "I would." They left the town behind, following a rutted road that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe deeply. Grace pulled the borrowed coat tighter around herself, grateful for its warmth. "Williams Ranch is about 10 miles northwest of town," Jake explained. He chose the location for the water access and the quality of grazing land. Built the house and outbuildings himself over the course of 3 years. He must have been very determined. He was. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead. William had a vision of what he wanted to build, and he did not let anything stand in his way. Not the harsh winters, not the isolation, not the setbacks that would have broken a lesser man. They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of the buggy and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Grace studied the landscape, so different from anything she had known in Philadelphia. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks white with snow, against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Pine trees stood like dark sentinels, and in the meadows between dried grasses poked through the snow. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Jake glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Most Eastern women find it too harsh, too empty. I find it honest." Grace chose her words carefully. "In Philadelphia, everything is hidden behind facades. The buildings crowd so close together you forget there is sky above. Here you can see for miles. There is nowhere to hide what you truly are." "That is the truth of it." Jake's voice held a note of approval. "Montana does not suffer pretense. You are what your actions prove you to be, not what your family name or your bank account suggests. Grace thought about this as they continued climbing into higher elevations. The road grew steeper, and Jake guided the horse with practiced skill around patches of ice and rougher terrain. After nearly 2 hours of travel, they crested a ridge, and Jake pulled the horse to a stop. There, he said simply, gesturing ahead. Grace caught her breath. Below them spread a small valley sheltered on 3 sides by rising hills. In the center stood a 2-story house built of logs, its lines clean and strong. A large barn dominated one side of the property, with several smaller outbuildings arranged in a practical half-circle. Behind the house, Grace could see the glint of water where a creek wound through the property. And beyond everything, pasture land stretched toward distant mountains. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "William built all of it. Every log in that house, every board in that barn. He had help from neighbors during the big raising days, but the design and most of the work was his." Jake guided the buggy down a gentler slope toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Grace could see more details. The house had a wide porch across the front with a swing at one end. The barn doors were painted red bright against the weathered wood. Everything spoke of care and planning, of a man building not just a house but a home. A lean man emerged from the barn as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He was perhaps 50, with sun-bleached hair and a deeply weathered face that had seen decades of frontier life. He watched their approach with the wary assessment common to men who lived in isolated places. Jake raised a hand in greeting as he brought the buggy to a halt. "Morning, Frank. This is Miss Grace Whitmore from Philadelphia." The man's eyebrows rose in recognition. "Miss Whitmore, you are William's intended. I am." Grace climbed down from the buggy before Jake could assist her, wanting to meet this man on equal footing. "Or I was. Mr. Thornton tells me that William passed away 3 weeks ago." Frank Caldwell removed his hat, revealing a bald pate surrounded by a fringe of graying hair. "I am powerful sorry, ma'am. Mr. Harper was a good man to work for, fair and honest. He was looking forward to your arrival something fierce." Despite her determination to remain composed, Grace felt her eyes prickle with tears. "Thank you for telling me that." Frank glanced at Jake, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Would you like to see inside the house, ma'am? Mr. Harper had us fixing it up special these past few weeks. Said his bride deserved a proper home." "I would like that very much." Frank led them toward the house, Jake following with the basket Widow Martinez had provided. The front door was solid oak, fitted with real glass windows on either side. Frank pushed it open and stepped back to let Grace enter first. The interior took her breath away. The front room was spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, but it was the color that made Grace stop in her tracks. The walls had been painted a soft blue, the exact shade of a summer sky just before dawn. It was the color she had mentioned in one of her early letters to William describing the view from her bedroom window in Philadelphia during the brief weeks of spring. "He painted it himself," Frank said quietly. "Sent all the way to Denver for the paint in that particular shade. Said you had written about liking that color, and he wanted you to feel at home." Grace moved into the room, running her hand along the wall. The paint was fresh, applied with care. A simple sofa and 2 chairs were arranged before the fireplace, and braided rugs covered the wooden floor. Everything was clean and ready, waiting for a mistress who would never arrive. Jake set the basket on a small dining table near the kitchen doorway. "The kitchen is through here if you would like to see it." Grace followed him into a surprisingly large kitchen. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner, its surface gleaming with fresh blacking. Open shelves held dishes and cookware, and a wide counter provided ample workspace. A hand pump stood over a deep sink, suggesting the luxury of indoor water. "The well is just behind the house," Frank explained. "Mr. Harper rigged that pump himself, saved hauling water from the creek in all weather." Upstairs, Grace found 2 bedrooms. The larger held a bed frame crafted from pine logs, sanded smooth and fitted together with obvious skill. A quilt in shades of blue and cream covered the mattress. Near the window stood a dressing table, its surface polished to a warm glow. "That came from Denver," Frank said. "Mr. Harper ordered it special, said a lady would want a proper place for her toilette." Grace sat on the bench before the dressing table, looking at her reflection in the oval mirror. From this position, she could see out the window to the valley beyond, to the mountains rising in the distance. A woman could sit here every morning, brushing her hair and watching the sun rise over those peaks. A woman could build a life in this house, in this valley. But that woman would not be her. Grace stood and turned to find Jake watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What will happen to the ranch now?" Frank sighed heavily. "That is the complicated part, ma'am. Mr. Harper had no family that anyone knows of. His lawyer in town, Mr. Peterson, is trying to sort out the legal matters. In the meantime, I am keeping the place running as best I can, but without a clear owner, things are uncertain. What about the bank? Surely William owed money on the property." "He did." Frank's expression grew troubled. "He took out a substantial loan 6 months back to expand the herd. The bank will want that money, and without someone to take over the ranch and keep it profitable, they will likely foreclose." Grace felt a surge of anger on William's behalf. He built all of this work for years to create something lasting, and now it will be taken away because of an accident. "That is the way of things sometimes," Jake said quietly. "The frontier does not care about a man's dreams or his hard work. It takes what it wants when it wants." They went back downstairs, and Frank excused himself to return to his work in the barn. Grace and Jake sat at the kitchen table, and she opened the basket Widow Martinez had packed. The bread was still warm, the cheese sharp and satisfying. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jake spoke. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Whitmore." Grace looked up from her bread. "I am listening. You need employment. I need someone who can manage accounts and keep records." His gray eyes were direct assessing. "My previous bookkeeper left for Denver 2 weeks ago, and the state of the ledgers is frankly alarming. I have been trying to manage them myself, but numbers are not my strength. You want me to keep books for your saloon, for the Silver Spur, and for my ranch. Both enterprises generate enough business to require proper accounting." Jake leaned back in his chair. "The pay would be $40 a month plus a room above the office at the Silver Spur. The room has its own entrance, so you need not go through the saloon proper if it troubles you." Grace considered this. $40 a month was more than she had expected, certainly enough to live on, with some left over for savings. But working for a saloon would mark her as questionable in the eyes of respectable society. As if reading her thoughts, Jake continued, "I will not pretend the Silver Spur is a church social, Miss Whitmore. But it is a legitimate business, and I run it according to strict standards. There is no gambling beyond friendly card games, no women offering anything beyond dance partners for hire. We host community gatherings, traveling shows, and Saturday night dances that half the town attends." Grace met his gaze steadily. "And what will people say about a woman working for you?" "They will say what they please, regardless of what you do." Jake's tone was matter-of-fact. "But those who matter will judge you by the quality of your work, not by assumptions about your character." Grace thought about her options. She could return to Philadelphia with her tail between her legs, admitting defeat and confirming every dire prediction her mother had made. Or she could stay here, take the work offered, and prove that Grace Whitmore was capable of far more than society had ever allowed her to attempt. "I accept your offer," she said. "When would you like me to start tomorrow if you are willing?" Jake stood and gathered the remains of their meal. "I will show you the office this afternoon so you can see what you are taking on." They prepared to leave, but Grace paused at the front door, looking back at the blue parlor. "This house should have been mine. William Harper and I should be planning our life together in these rooms." Jake moved to stand beside her. "He would have been good to you. William had his faults, as we all do, but he would have valued you for your mind as well as for the partnership you could provide." "How can you be so certain?" "Because he told me." Jake's voice was quiet but firm. In his letters, he wrote about how refreshing it was to correspond with a woman who asked intelligent questions about ranch management and wanted to understand the economics of cattle raising. He said you challenged him to think more carefully about his plans, to consider angles he had not explored. Grace blinked against sudden tears. "I wish I could have known him." "So do I, for your sake and for his." They rode back toward Clearwater in thoughtful silence. The sun had climbed higher, warming the air slightly, though it was still bitterly cold. Grace found herself studying Jake from the corner of her eye. He was a puzzle, this frontier man who kept promises to dead friends and offered employment to stranded women without expecting anything improper in return. As if sensing her scrutiny, Jake spoke without looking at her. "You are wondering if you can trust me. I am wondering why you are helping me, beyond your promise to William." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. "I know what it is like to be alone in a hard place with limited options. I know what it feels like when people judge you based on circumstances beyond your control." He glanced at her briefly. "Your limp does not define who you are, Miss Whitmore, any more than my occupation defines me. But people will try to make those things the whole of our stories unless we prove otherwise." Grace absorbed this understanding that Jake Thornton carried his own burdens, his own judgments from a society that saw only surfaces. They reached Clearwater in early afternoon. Instead of taking Grace directly to the boarding house, Jake guided the buggy to the Silver Spur. In daylight, the building looked well-maintained and prosperous. The windows were clean, the paint fresh, and the porch swept clear of snow. Jake helped Grace down from the buggy and led her to a side entrance. "This door leads directly to the office and the room above. You can come and go without passing through the main saloon if you prefer." He unlocked the door and ushered her into a small but tidy office. A desk dominated the space, its surface covered with ledgers and loose papers. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and a pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, cold now but clearly functional. "The ledgers are in worse shape than I initially thought," Jake admitted, gesturing to the chaos on the desk. "My previous bookkeeper had a system that made sense only to him. Since he left, I have been trying to maintain the records, but I fear I have only made things worse." Grace moved to the desk and opened the topmost ledger. Her trained eye immediately spotted problems. Columns did not align properly. Dates were missing or illegible. Entire weeks of transactions appeared to have been recorded from memory rather than from actual receipts. "This is quite disorganized," she said mildly. "That is a diplomatic assessment." Grace turned pages, her frown deepening. "These numbers do not add up. See here, the total for spirits purchased in October is listed as $87, but when I sum the individual entries, I get $112. Jake moved to stand beside her, looking over her shoulder. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain." Grace ran her finger down the column. "Your bookkeeper either made numerous mathematical errors, or he was deliberately falsifying the records." "Why would he do that?" Grace met Jake's eyes. "To hide the fact that he was stealing from you." Jake's jaw tightened. "How much I cannot say for certain without going through all the ledgers in detail, but based on this 1 month alone, I would estimate at least $20 or $30. If he was doing this consistently over many months, the total could be several $100s. Jake swore under his breath, then apologized. "Pardon my language, Miss Whitmore. Under the circumstances, I believe strong language is warranted." Grace closed the ledger. "I will need at least a week to untangle this mess and determine the full extent of the theft. Take whatever time you need." Jake's expression was grim. "I want to know exactly how much Daniel stole from me." A knock at the office door interrupted them. Jake opened it to reveal a woman of perhaps 40 years, striking rather than pretty, with dark hair swept up in an elegant arrangement. Her dress was fashionable but not ostentatious, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "Mason, I heard you were back." Her voice was rich and warm. "And you have brought a guest. Grace, allow me to introduce Ruby Coleman. She is my business partner and manages the entertainment aspects of the Silver Spur. Ruby, this is Miss Grace Whitmore, our new bookkeeper." Ruby's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The mail order bride? I heard you had arrived in town?" Grace lifted her chin slightly. "I am no longer a mail order bride, Miss Coleman. William Harper is dead, and I am now simply a woman seeking honest employment." Ruby studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Good. I have no patience for simpering females who expect the world to cater to them." She extended her hand. "Welcome to the Silver Spur, Miss Whitmore." Grace shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of physical work. "Thank you." Ruby turned to Jake. "Have you shown her the room upstairs?" "Not yet." "Come then." Ruby gestured for Grace to follow. "Let me give you the tour of your new quarters." They climbed a narrow staircase that led from the office to the second floor. Ruby opened a door to reveal a surprisingly pleasant room. It was larger than Grace's current quarters at the boarding house, with a real bed instead of just a cot, a small sitting area with a stove and a washstand with a proper mirror. Not fancy, but private, Ruby said. The window looks out over the side street, so you will not have to listen to the noise from the saloon proper. There is a bathing room at the end of the hall that you can use. Water has to be hauled up, but it is better than bathing in a basin. Grace moved to the window and looked out. From here she could see the mountains in the distance, the same view she had admired from Williams' ranch. It was not the home she had expected, but it was more than she had any right to expect given her circumstances. "It is perfect," she said. "Thank you." Ruby nodded approvingly. "You can move in whenever you are ready. Jake mentioned you are staying at Widow Martinez's place for now." "That woman charges highway robbery rates," Ruby observed. "You will be better off here saving your wages for something more useful than lining her pockets." After Ruby left, Grace and Jake stood in the small room, an awkward silence falling between them. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. "I know this is not what you came west seeking, Miss Whitmore, but I hope it will serve until you determine what you truly want from your time in Montana." Grace turned to face him. "You have been more than kind, Mr. Thornton." "Jake, I do not know how to thank you. No thanks necessary." Jake moved toward the door. "I will leave you to settle in. The office is yours whenever you wish to begin work." After he left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new quarters. It was a far cry from the ranch house, with its blue painted parlor and its view of the valley. But it was hers earned through her own capabilities rather than granted through marriage. She thought of her mother, who would be horrified to learn her daughter was living above a saloon and keeping books for a man of questionable reputation. But her mother had forfeited the right to judgment when she made it clear that Grace was no longer welcome in Philadelphia. Grace rose and walked back to the office, her practiced eye already planning how she would organize the chaos of ledgers and receipts. This was work she understood, work she was good at. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a spark of purpose, of possibility. The next morning, Grace moved her belongings from Widow Martinez's boarding house to her new quarters above the Silver Spur. The widow accepted the news with equanimity, though she did offer one piece of advice. "Jake Thornton is a good man, child, but working for him will invite gossip. Steel yourself for it." Grace paid her bill, thanked the widow for her hospitality, and carried her single trunk to her new home. Ruby helped her settle in, proving surprisingly friendly once her initial wariness faded. "You will want to come down for the Saturday dance this week," Ruby said, as she helped Grace arrange her few belongings. "It will help the town see you as part of the community, rather than some scandalous Eastern woman living in sin above a saloon." "I do not dance," Grace said quietly. "Everyone dances, Miss Whitmore." Ruby's tone was kind but firm. "Some of us just have not found the right partner yet." That evening, Grace descended to the office and lit the lamps. She had the entire night ahead of her, and she intended to make significant progress on the ledgers. She started with the most recent entries, working backward to establish patterns in Daniel's theft. It was painstaking work, but Grace found it satisfying. Numbers did not lie. They told clear stories to those who knew how to read them. And the story these numbers told was one of systematic embezzlement over many months. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear Jake enter until he spoke. "You should not work so late. You will damage your eyes in this lamplight." Grace looked up, surprised to find it was nearly midnight. "I wanted to make progress while the details were fresh in my mind." Jake moved closer, looking at the neat columns she had created. "You have found more discrepancies, many more." Grace pointed to her notations. "Your bookkeeper was clever about it. He never took large amounts at once. Instead, he shaved small sums from multiple accounts. $1 here from the whiskey inventory, $3 there from the weekly receipts. Over time, it adds up significantly. How much total? Grace consulted her figures. Based on the 6 months I have examined so far, at least $270, possibly more once I review the older records." Jake's expression darkened. "That is more than I pay Frank for an entire year of ranch work. I am sorry to bring you such unwelcome news. Better to know the truth." Jake pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "At least now I understand why the accounts never seemed to balance properly. I kept thinking I was making errors in my calculations." "You were not." Grace closed the ledger she had been working on. Daniel was very systematic in covering his tracks. If I were less familiar with bookkeeping, I might have missed the pattern entirely. Jake studied her for a long moment. William was right about you. What did he say? That you had a mind sharp as any blade and twice as useful. Jake's smile was faint but genuine. He said you asked questions in your letters that made him think more carefully about his business practices, that you suggested improvements he had not considered. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at this second-hand praise from a man she had never met. I wish I could have helped him in person. You are helping him now. Jake gestured to the ledgers. This work you are doing, setting my accounts in order, it is the kind of partnership he hoped for. Someone who could contribute real value, not just keep house and bear children. Is that so unusual? Out here. Jake considered the question. Less unusual than in the East, perhaps. Frontier life requires everyone to pull their weight. A woman who can only do domestic tasks is a liability when there is so much work to be done. But a woman who can manage accounts or doctor livestock or handle a rifle when necessary, that woman is worth her weight in gold. Grace absorbed this understanding that she had come to a place where her capabilities might finally be valued more than her deficits. It is different here, different than Philadelphia, different than anywhere I have imagined. Jake stood to leave, then paused. There is one more thing you should know, Miss Whitmore. I have been discussing William's ranch with his lawyer. Grace looked up sharply. What kind of discussion? I am considering purchasing the property. The bank is willing to transfer William's loan if someone assumes ownership quickly. Jake met her eyes. But I wanted to consult with you first, given your connection to the place. Why would you need my consultation? Because you were to be the mistress of that ranch. You traveled 2,000 miles expecting to build a life there. It seems only right that you should have some say in what becomes of it. Grace was silent for a moment, moved by this unexpected consideration. What would you do with it if you purchased it? Keep Frank on as foreman. Continue building the herd. William started. Maybe eventually combine operations with my own ranch for greater efficiency. Jake leaned against the doorframe. But I also wanted to propose something else. A business arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Grace set down her pen and gave Jake her full attention. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. I have the capital to purchase the ranch and maintain operations. You have the business acumen to manage the financial side effectively. We could form a partnership similar to my arrangement with Ruby here at the Silver Spur. You want me to be your business partner in a cattle ranch. I want someone I can trust to handle the accounts, manage the economics, help plan for growth. Jake's gray eyes were serious. In exchange, you would receive a percentage of the profits and a say in major business decisions. It would be a legal partnership with contracts drawn up properly. Grace's mind raced. A partnership meant independence, real financial security, a stake in something substantial. But it also meant tying herself to Jake Thornton in ways that would invite even more gossip than her current employment. Why me? She asked. You barely know me. I know enough. Jake straightened. I know you can spot financial irregularities I missed. I know you ask intelligent questions and think strategically. I know you faced abandonment and heartbreak with dignity instead of hysteria. And I know William Harper chose well when he asked you to share his life. Grace stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened street. A partnership, ownership, the chance to build something real instead of merely surviving. I need time to consider your offer, she said. Take all the time you need. Jake moved toward the door. The offer stands. After he left, Grace returned to the ledgers, but her mind was only half on the numbers. The other half was wrestling with the implications of Jake's proposal. A joint venture with a man she had known for less than 2 days. It should have seemed reckless, impulsive. But Grace had learned that survival sometimes required bold action. She had traveled across a continent on the promise of letters from a stranger. Surely partnering with a man who had already proven his trustworthiness was no more risky than that had been. The following days fell into a productive rhythm. Grace worked in the office from morning until late afternoon, systematically organizing the chaos Daniel had left behind. She created new ledgers with clear categories, established a filing system for receipts, and began the process of verifying inventory against recorded purchases. Ruby proved to be a valuable ally, explaining the rhythms of the Silver Spur's business and introducing Grace to regular customers. Grace learned that the saloon was indeed a community hub, hosting meetings of the town council celebrations for births and weddings and gatherings of various civic organizations. On Saturday evening, Ruby appeared at Grace's door with a dress draped over her arm. "What is this?" Grace asked. "Something appropriate for the dance tonight." Ruby held up the garment, a deep green silk that would bring out Grace's eyes. "You cannot attend in your work dress, and I suspect you did not pack ball gowns when you left Philadelphia. I told you I do not dance." Ruby's expression softened. "Not even if the right partner asks." Before Grace could respond, Ruby continued, "Jake Thornton is one of the best dancers in Clearwater. He is patient and strong enough to guide a partner through any difficulty. If anyone can make you comfortable on a dance floor, it is him." Grace wanted to refuse, but something in Ruby's expression stopped her. This was more than just an invitation to dance. It was a test, a way for the community to measure whether Grace Whitmore would hide herself away in shame or step forward with confidence. "Very well," she said. "I will attend." The dance hall portion of the Silver Spur was transformed for Saturday night. Tables and chairs had been pushed to the walls, leaving the wooden floor open for dancing. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across the space. A small platform at one end held musicians, 3 men with a fiddle, a guitar, and an accordion. Grace entered, wearing Ruby's green dress, her hair arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual simple knot. She felt exposed, vulnerable, in ways that had nothing to do with the dress's neckline. Jake appeared at her side almost immediately, dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders. He looked different than he did in work clothes, more refined, but no less masculine. "Miss Whitmore." He offered a small bow. "I am glad you decided to attend." Ruby was quite insistent. Ruby usually is. Jake smiled. "May I have the honor of this dance?" Grace hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. "I should warn you, Mr. Thornton, I have not danced since I was a child before my illness. I am not certain I remember how. The waltz is simple." Jake offered his hand. "You need only follow my lead." Grace placed her hand in his, allowing him to guide her onto the floor. His right hand settled at her waist, warm and steady through the fabric of her dress. His left hand held hers firmly but gently. The music began, a slow waltz that seemed designed for beginners. "Just feel the rhythm," Jake said quietly. "Step with me. I will not let you fall." They began to move, and Grace's first steps were awkward, hesitant. Her weak leg threatened to betray her, but Jake adjusted his movements to accommodate her limitations, taking more of her weight during turns, slowing the pace slightly. "Look at me, not at your feet," he instructed. "Trust me to guide you." Grace raised her eyes to his face and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In the lamplight, his gray eyes seemed almost silver. His expression was serious, focused entirely on her. They moved across the floor, and gradually Grace's movements became more fluid. Jake's strength and skill made up for her deficiency. To anyone watching, they might have looked like any other couple enjoying a dance. "You are doing well," Jake said after they had completed a full circuit of the floor. "You are an excellent teacher. I have had practice. My mother insisted I learn when I was young. She said a gentleman should know how to partner a lady properly." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Jake's expression flickered with old grief. "She died when I was 17. Fever took her and my younger brother in the same week." "I am sorry. It was a long time ago." Jake turned them smoothly to avoid another couple. "But I have never forgotten what she taught me, including the lesson that strength should be used to support others, not to dominate them." The music ended, and Jake led Grace back to the edge of the floor. Other couples were forming for the next dance, but he did not ask her to continue. "You should dance with others," Grace said. "You do not need to spend the entire evening partnering the cripple." Jake's expression hardened. "Do not use that word about yourself, Miss Whitmore. You have a weak leg. That is a fact, not a judgment, and I will dance with whomever I choose for whatever reasons please me." His vehemence surprised her. "I apologize. I should not have said that." "No, you should not have." Jake's tone softened. "You are worth more than you seem to believe, Grace Whitmore. Perhaps it is time you started acting like it." He left her then, moving to ask Ruby to dance. Grace watched them move across the floor, Ruby laughing at something Jake said. They moved together with the easy comfort of old friends, and Grace felt a small pang of something that might have been jealousy. A voice beside her made her turn. "You must be the new bookkeeper." Grace found herself facing a woman of perhaps 30, elegantly dressed with blonde hair and calculating blue eyes. I am Margaret Fairfield. My husband owns the bank." The woman's smile did not reach her eyes. How convenient for Jake Thornton to find such capable help right when he needed it. The implication was clear. Grace lifted her chin. "Mr. Thornton required a bookkeeper. I required employment. It is a straightforward business arrangement." "Of course?" Margaret's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "And you are living above the saloon, I understand, in a private apartment with my own entrance, yes. How very modern." Margaret's gaze swept over Grace's borrowed dress. "I do hope you know what you're getting into, Miss Whitmore. Frontier life can be harsh on Eastern women, especially those without proper protection." "I appreciate your concern," Grace said coolly, "but I am quite capable of protecting myself." "Are you?" Margaret glanced toward where Jake was still dancing with Ruby. "Because from where I stand, it appears you are quite dependent on Jake Thornton's goodwill. One wonders what will happen if that goodwill runs out." Before Grace could formulate a response, Ruby and Jake returned. Ruby immediately positioned herself between Grace and Margaret, her expression pleasant, but her eyes hard. "Margaret, how lovely to see you. I did not realize the bank allowed you time away from counting money." Margaret's smile tightened. "Always a pleasure, Ruby. Do give my regards to your girls." The dismissal was clear. Margaret moved away, leaving Grace feeling slightly shaken by the encounter. "Do not let her trouble you," Ruby said. "Margaret Fairfield makes it her business to know everyone else's business and to make judgments accordingly. She implied that my arrangement with Jake was inappropriate. She implies that about every woman who comes within 10 feet of Jake." Ruby's tone was matter-of-fact. "Margaret has been trying to match Jake with her younger sister for 2 years. The fact that he shows no interest infuriates her." Jake had been listening to this exchange with obvious discomfort. "Perhaps we should discuss this elsewhere." They moved to a quieter corner of the hall, away from the dancing and the curious eyes. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I apologize for Margaret's behavior," he said. "She means well in her own way, but she has strong opinions about propriety." "She thinks I am your mistress," Grace said bluntly. "She thinks every woman I speak to might be my mistress." Jake's frustration was evident. "After my wife died, half the women in Clearwater decided I needed rescuing. The other half decided I was a tragic figure in need of comfort." "Margaret belongs to the first group." Grace absorbed this information. "You were married." "For 3 years." Jake's voice flattened. "Anna died in childbirth 5 years ago. The baby died with her. I am so sorry. It was a long time ago, but apparently not long enough for certain people to stop seeing me as a widower first and a man second." Ruby touched Jake's arm gently. "Perhaps it is time we discuss the partnership offer with Miss Whitmore, properly with all the details laid out." They retired to Jake's office, leaving the dance to continue without them. Jake pulled out a folder of papers and spread them on the desk. "This is the bank's assessment of Williams Ranch. The property, the buildings, the livestock, the equipment. The total value is estimated at $8,000. William owed $3,000 on his loan." Jake looked at Grace. "I can purchase the property outright, paying off the loan and compensating William's estate for the equity. But I want to do more than just buy it." "What do you have in mind?" "I propose we form a business alliance. I will provide the capital and handle the physical operations. You will manage the financial side and help with strategic planning. We split the profits 60-40, with my 60 reflecting the capital investment and my 40 reflecting the management expertise." Grace finished. "Exactly." Jake pushed a contract across the desk. "This creates a legal partnership with clear terms. This is what my lawyer drew up. It specifies your responsibilities, your share of profits, your authority to make financial decisions up to certain amounts. It also includes provisions for dissolving the partnership if either of us wishes to end the arrangement." Grace read through the contract carefully. It was thorough and fair, protecting both parties while clearly delineating expectations. She looked up to find both Jake and Ruby watching her. "This is very generous," she said slowly. "It is fair," Jake corrected. "You bring valuable skills to this partnership, Miss Whitmore. Skills that will make the ranch more profitable than I could make it alone." Grace thought about her options. She could refuse continue working only as Jake's bookkeeper, maintaining the safety of a simple employment arrangement. Or she could take this risk, become a true partner, have a real stake in building something lasting. She thought of William Harper, who had built a ranch from nothing, who had chosen her as a partner based on intelligence and compatibility rather than social standing or physical perfection, who had painted a parlor blue because she mentioned liking that color in a letter. "I accept," she said. "Where do I sign?" The contract was signed on a cold Monday morning in the offices of Peterson and Associates Attorneys at Law. Grace sat across from Jake as the lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and graying hair, witnessed their signatures and affixed his seal to the document. When it was done, Grace Whitmore owned 40% of what had once been William Harper's dream. "Congratulations, Mr. Thornton, Miss Whitmore." Mr. Peterson gathered the papers with practiced efficiency. "You are now legal partners in the ownership and operation of the Harper Ranch, or will you be renaming it?" Jake looked at Grace. "That decision belongs to both of us now." Grace considered for a moment. "The Thornton and Whitmore Cattle Company. It seems appropriate." "Agreed." Jake extended his hand and Grace shook it, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip. "Partners." The word carried weight, promise, possibility. Over the following 2 weeks, Grace divided her time between the Silver Spurs books and learning the intricacies of ranch management. Frank Caldwell proved invaluable, patiently explaining the cycles of cattle, raising the costs of feed and veterinary care, the market prices for beef, and how they fluctuated with the seasons. Grace absorbed it all with the same methodical attention she applied to ledgers. She created new accounting systems for the ranch, tracking every expense and every head of cattle. She identified inefficiencies in supply purchasing and negotiated better rates with merchants in Clearwater. "Your Miss Whitmore has a sharp mind," Frank told Jake one afternoon as they reviewed her latest cost analysis. "She found ways to save nearly $80 on feed costs for the winter. That is money we can put toward expanding the breeding stock." Jake smiled. "She is not my Miss Whitmore, Frank. She is my business partner." "If you say so, boss." Frank's expression suggested he saw more than Jake was willing to admit. Grace herself was too focused on work to notice the subtle shift in how Jake looked at her. She was building something, creating value through her own skills and knowledge. For the first time in her life, she felt truly useful, truly valued for her capabilities rather than judged for her limitations. But their peace was not to last. It was late February when the stranger arrived in Clearwater. Grace was working in the office when Ruby burst in, her usually composed features troubled. "There is a man downstairs asking questions about the Harper Ranch. Says he is family." Grace set down her pen. "What kind of family claims to be William's cousin from back east, Charles Harper from St. Louis?" Ruby's skepticism was evident. "He has papers, documents that look official. Jake is speaking with him now." Grace descended to the main floor of the Silver Spur, where Jake stood near the bar in conversation with a well-dressed man of perhaps 40 years. The stranger had refined features and an air of Eastern sophistication that reminded Grace uncomfortably of Philadelphia society. "Ah, and you must be Miss Whitmore." The man turned toward her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am Charles Harper Williams' cousin. I have heard about your unfortunate situation." "My situation is none of your concern, Mr. Harper." Grace kept her voice level. "And I was unaware that William had family. We were not close," Charles admitted smoothly. "William and I had a falling out some years ago over a business matter. But blood is blood, and when I learned of his death, I felt compelled to come west and see to his affairs." "His affairs have been settled," Jake said. "The ranch has been legally purchased from his estate." Charles's smile widened slightly. "Ah, yes. I heard about that arrangement. Very convenient timing, Mr. Thornton. My cousin barely cold in his grave, and you snatch up his property. I paid full market value." Jake's voice hardened. "The bank can confirm every detail of the transaction. I am sure they can." Charles produced a leather folder from his coat. but I am afraid there may be some complications regarding the property boundaries." What complications? Grace moved closer, her instincts warning her of trouble. Charles spread several documents on the bar. These are surveyor's maps from William's original land claim, along with correspondence between William and various territorial offices. According to these documents, the ranch property extends considerably farther north than the current deed indicates. Jake examined the papers, his expression darkening. These show the boundary extending nearly 5 miles past Cottonwood Creek. Exactly. Charles's tone was sympathetic, but his eyes were calculating. It appears there was an error in the original survey work. The property William claimed, and which you have now purchased, is actually much larger than anyone realized, including a substantial portion of what is currently considered public grazing land. "That is impossible," Grace said. "William was meticulous about documentation. He would not have made such an error." "Perhaps not an error," Charles suggested. "Perhaps simply an opportunity he never had time to pursue before his untimely death." He gathered his papers. "I have filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office to correct the boundary records. Once the claim is approved, the Harper estate, of which I am the legal heir, will have rightful ownership of the disputed land." Grace felt cold spreading through her chest. Cottonwood Creek was the primary water source for the ranch. Without access to that water, the grazing land they had purchased would be nearly worthless during the dry summer months. "This is fraud," Jake said flatly. "Those documents are forgeries. That is a serious accusation, Mr. Thornton." Charles's expression remained pleasant. "I assure you these are authentic records from the Territorial Survey Office. You are welcome to verify them yourself." After Charles left, Jake and Grace sat in the now empty office, the implications of this development settling over them like a shroud. "He is lying," Jake said. "William never mentioned extended boundaries. He was proud of what he had claimed and built. He would have told me if there was more land available." Grace was already thinking strategically. "We need to verify the authenticity of those documents, and we need to find out if William had any actual family who could contest this claim." "How do we do that?" Grace thought of her mother, still in Philadelphia, with her connections to society and business circles. "I can send telegrams east. My mother has contacts who could investigate whether Charles Harper is who he claims to be. That would take weeks. Then we use those weeks to build our own case." Grace pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "William kept correspondence. Frank mentioned that he saved important letters. We need to find those letters and see if he ever mentioned family connections." Over the next 3 days, Grace and Jake searched William's house for any documentation that might help their case. They found boxes of letters in the attic, carefully organized and dated. Grace read through them methodically, looking for any mention of relatives. On the 4th day, she found something. "Jake, look at this." Grace held up a letter dated 2 years earlier. William mentions a cousin in Boston. "Jonathan Harper, a merchant. He writes about sending Jonathan information about ranch development out west." "Boston, not St. Louis," Jake noted. "That contradicts Charles's claim." Grace immediately composed a telegram to her mother, asking her to locate Jonathan Harper in Boston and verify his relationship to William. She paid extra for the fastest possible delivery and response. While they waited for word from the east, Charles Harper made himself visible around Clearwater. He took rooms above the general store and began ingratiating himself with local business owners. Grace heard reports of him buying drinks at various establishments, subtly questioning people about the ranch and about Jake's business dealings. "He is gathering information," Grace told Jake one evening. "Building a picture of our vulnerabilities. Let him try." Jake's jaw was set. "We have done nothing wrong. The ranch was purchased legally, but he is planting seeds of doubt." Grace had observed enough of small-town dynamics to understand how reputation and gossip could damage even the innocent. People will wonder if perhaps there is some truth to his claims. They will question whether we took advantage of William's death. Her prediction proved accurate. Within a week, Grace noticed a change in how some townspeople treated her. Widow Martinez remained friendly, but others began to keep their distance. At church on Sunday, several women who had previously greeted Grace with cautious warmth now avoided her eyes. Only Ruby remained staunchly supportive, dismissing the gossip with characteristic bluntness. "Small minds create small problems," she told Grace. "Let them whisper. Your work speaks louder than their speculation." The response from Philadelphia arrived 2 weeks after Grace's initial telegram. Her mother had located Jonathan Harper and verified that he was indeed William's cousin. More importantly, Jonathan had never heard of anyone named Charles Harper in the family. He was preparing to travel to Montana himself to contest the fraudulent claim. "We have him," Grace said, reading the telegram aloud to Jake. "Charles Harper is an imposter." But Jake's expression remained troubled. Proving he is not family is one thing. Proving those surveyor documents are forged is another. He could still tie us up in legal proceedings for months, maybe years. Then we need to find out who actually created those documents. Grace's mind was already working through possibilities. Someone with knowledge of territorial survey procedures, someone who had access to official paperwork. They took their findings to Mr. Peterson, who examined the documents Charles had filed with grave concern. "These appear authentic at first glance," the lawyer admitted. "The seals look correct, the formatting matches territorial standards. But there are subtle inconsistencies. See here, this signature is supposedly from the territorial surveyor, but the handwriting does not quite match his known signature from other documents. Can you prove they are forged? Not conclusively, not without more evidence?" Peterson removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "What we need is to determine who created these forgeries. That would unravel the entire scheme." Grace thought about Daniel Jake's former bookkeeper, who had stolen hundreds of dollars before disappearing to Denver. A man familiar with falsifying documents for personal gain. "Jake, what if Daniel is involved?" She turned to him. "He worked for you, had access to business records, knew the layout of properties in the area. What if Charles Harper hired him to create these forgeries?" Jake sat forward, interest sparking in his eyes. "Daniel left town about 2 months ago. Charles appeared 3 weeks ago. The timing fits. But how do we prove a connection?" Peterson asked. "We find Daniel," Grace said simply. "He is in Denver. Someone there must know where he is staying, who he has been associating with." Jake was already standing. "I will ride to Denver myself if necessary. Number?" Grace shook her head. "We cannot both leave the ranch unattended, and I need to stay here to manage the legal response. But we could hire someone to investigate." Peterson cleared his throat. "I may have a contact in Denver, a gentleman who specializes in locating people who prefer not to be found. If you authorize the expense, I can send him word to begin searching for Daniel." "Do it," Jake and Grace said simultaneously. While they waited for news from Denver, Charles Harper made his boldest move yet. He appeared at the ranch one afternoon while Jake was in town, presenting himself to Frank Caldwell with smooth confidence. "I thought I should see the property that will soon revert to the Harper family estate," he told Frank. "As the rightful heir, I have every right to inspect what is mine." Frank, to his credit, did not allow Charles past the front gate. "You can inspect it from here, same as anyone else on public road, but you are not setting foot on this property without Mr. Thornton or Miss Whitmore present." Grace heard about the incident when she rode out to the ranch later that day. Frank was still bristling with indignation. "Acted like he already owned the place, ma'am. Wanted to walk through the house, examine the outbuildings. I told him he could examine the view from the road or examine the business end of my rifle." Grace felt a surge of gratitude for Frank's loyalty. "You did exactly right. Do not let him on the property under any circumstances." That evening, as Grace worked in the ranch office reviewing expenses, Jake appeared in the doorway, looking more serious than she had ever seen him. "There is something you should know," he said. "Charles Harper has been making inquiries at the bank about our financial situation, asking about loans, debts, how much capital we have available. Why would he care about our finances? Because he is planning something." Jake moved to look out the window at the darkening valley. "If he can prove we are financially vulnerable, he could force us into a settlement, offer to drop the boundary dispute if we pay him off." "We are not paying him anything," Grace said firmly. "We have done nothing wrong, I know. But defending ourselves in court will cost money we could be using to expand the ranch. Even if we win, we lose time and resources." Jake turned back to face her. "That is what men like Charles Harper count on. They do not need to win. They just need to make fighting too expensive. Grace thought about this anger building in her chest. She had come too far, risked too much to be defeated by a confidence man and his forged documents. Then we need to end this quickly. We need to find Daniel, prove the forgeries, and expose Charles Harper before he can do more damage. The break they needed came from an unexpected source. Ruby appeared at the ranch 3 days later, accompanied by a young woman Grace had never seen before. "This is Annie," Ruby explained. "She works at the boarding house in Silver Creek, about 20 miles east of here. She has information about our Mr. Charles Harper." Annie was perhaps 20, thin and nervous, twisting her hands in her apron. "I did not know if I should say anything, but Ruby said it might be important." "Tell them what you told me," Ruby encouraged. "A man matching Mr. Harper's description stayed at our boarding house about a month ago. He was there for nearly 2 weeks, and he had a visitor several times. A younger man with red hair who seemed nervous, always looking over his shoulder." Daniel Jake breathed. "Daniel has red hair." They talked in low voices, but I overheard some of their conversation. Annie's voice was barely above a whisper. The red-haired man kept saying something about papers being ready, about how the territorial seal looked perfect. "And Mr. Harper, or whatever his real name is, he laughed and said something about easy money from desperate ranchers." Grace exchanged a glance with Jake. This was the connection they needed. "Can you swear to this in a legal statement?" Annie nodded. "If it will help, I do not like men who cheat honest people." Peterson drew up an affidavit based on Annie's testimony, and they sent it along with their other evidence to the territorial authorities. But before any official response could come, Charles Harper forced a confrontation. He appeared in Clearwater on a Friday afternoon with 2 men Grace did not recognize. They were rough-looking, with the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence. Charles positioned himself in the street outside the Silver Spur and called for Jake to come out. Grace watched from the window as Jake emerged, his hand resting casually near the gun he wore when traveling between town and ranch. "Mr. Harper." Jake's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "To what do I owe this public display? I have come to make you a final offer, Thornton." Charles's confidence seemed absolute. "I will withdraw my claim to the disputed land in exchange for $500. That is more than fair, given that the legal fees alone would cost you twice that amount." "I am not paying you a single cent," Jake said flatly. "Your claim is fraudulent. Your documents are forged, and you are not who you claim to be." Charles's smile faded. "You are making a serious mistake. The only mistake was yours coming here with your scheme." Jake took a step forward. "We have evidence connecting you to Daniel, my former bookkeeper. We have testimony placing you together while he created your forged surveyor documents. And we have confirmation from William Harper's actual cousin in Boston that you are an imposter." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Charles's face. "You cannot prove any of that." "Actually, we can." Grace stepped out onto the porch, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "The territorial authorities are reviewing our evidence now. By my estimation, you have perhaps 3 days before they issue a warrant for your arrest." Charles looked between them, his polished facade cracking. "You think you have won?" "I think you underestimated us," Grace replied. "You assumed we would be easy marks, a grieving widow and a desperate Eastern woman. But you failed to account for the fact that we are also intelligent, resourceful, and unwilling to be cheated." The 2 men with Charles shifted uncomfortably, clearly reassessing the situation. Charles himself seemed to be calculating his options. "This is not over," he said finally, but his tone lacked conviction. "Yes, it is." Jake's voice carried absolute certainty. "Leave Clearwater now, and I will not press charges for harassment and fraud. Stay, and you will spend the next several years in a territorial prison." Charles Harper, or whatever his real name was, stared at them for a long moment. Then with a curse he turned and walked toward the livery stable, his hired men following behind. Grace watched him go, feeling the tension drain from her body. It is really over. Not quite. We still need the territorial authorities to officially reject his claim. But yes, I think he is done. She was right. Within a week, word came that the land office had declared Charles Harper's documents fraudulent and dismissed his claim entirely. The boundaries of the Thornton and Whitmore Cattle Company were confirmed as originally recorded. Moreover, the territorial marshal sent word that a man matching Charles Harper's description had been arrested in Wyoming, attempting a similar land fraud scheme. His real name was Edward Dalton, and he had warrants outstanding in 3 territories. Grace read the marshal's report aloud to Jake, Ruby, and Frank in the ranch house parlor. When she finished, Frank let out a long breath. "Glad that is settled. Now maybe we can get back to the business of raising cattle." But Jake was looking at Grace with an expression she could not quite interpret. "You did that. You figured out the connection to Daniel, found the witness, built the case that defeated him. We did it together." "No." Jake shook his head. "I would have been prepared to fight him physically if necessary, but I would not have thought to investigate his background to build a legal case. That was you, Grace. Your intelligence and your strategic thinking saved the ranch." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "We make a good team." "Yes," Jake said quietly. "We do." Ruby and Frank exchanged knowing looks and made excuses to leave, giving Grace and Jake privacy in the blue-painted parlor. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the walls in shades of gold. "There is something I have been wanting to say," Jake began, then stopped, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. Grace waited, her heart beating faster. "When William asked me to look after his mail-order bride, I agreed because he was my friend and because it was the right thing to do." Jake moved closer to where she stood by the window. "But somewhere in these past weeks, my reasons changed. Changed how I find myself looking forward to our morning meetings about ranch business more than is strictly necessary. I notice how the lamplight catches in your hair when you work late in the office. I admire not just your mind, though I do admire it greatly, but your courage, your determination, your refusal to be defined by other people's limitations." Grace could barely breathe. "Jake, I know this is not what you came west seeking. You expected to marry William to build a life with him, and I do not presume to replace him in your affections." But he paused, seeming to choose his words with great care. "These past months have shown me that love does not come only once in a lifetime. That mutual respect and collaboration can grow into something deeper. That hope is not foolishness when it is backed by shared purpose and genuine regard." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Grace watched as he unwrapped it, revealing a rose forged from iron, its petals hammered thin and delicate, despite the strength of the metal. "I made this," Jake said. "Every petal took hours at the forge, heating and shaping and tempering. I wanted to create something that would last, something that would not wilt like flowers, but would endure through time." "It is beautiful," Grace whispered. "I am asking if you will marry me, Grace Whitmore. Not because protocol demands it, not because our partnership requires it, but because I cannot imagine building a future without you. Because when I think about tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, you are in every version I see." Grace took the iron rose, feeling its weight in her hand, seeing the care evident in every carefully shaped petal. She thought of William Harper, who had seen her worth through letters and chosen her for her mind. And she thought of Jake Thornton, who had honored his promise to a dead friend, and in doing so had shown her what true partnership could mean. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Jake's smile transformed his face, erasing the lines of worry and replacing them with pure joy. He pulled her into his arms, and Grace went willingly, feeling safe and valued and seen in a way she had never experienced before. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning each other. But it deepened into something more, a promise of partnership and passion, of shared burdens and shared triumphs. When they finally drew apart, Grace laughed softly. "What would William think of this?" "I think," Jake said, touching his forehead to hers, "he would be glad that his two favorite people found each other. He wanted you to have a good life in Montana. I intend to spend the rest of mine making sure you do." They were married in early April as spring painted the valley in shades of green and wildflowers dotted the meadows. The ceremony took place in the small church in Clearwater, with half the town in attendance. Ruby stood beside Grace, and Frank stood with Jake. Grace wore a dress of cream-colored silk, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Jake wore a dark suit that made him look formal and handsome and slightly uncomfortable. When he took her hand and repeated his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Jacob Thornton, take you. Grace Whitmore to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Grace repeated the same words, meaning every syllable. This was not the marriage she had imagined when she left Philadelphia. It was better. It was built on mutual respect and shared purpose, on friendship that had grown into love through working side by side toward common objectives. The reception was held at the Silver Spur, which had been decorated with spring flowers and white ribbons. The entire town seemed to have turned out, even Margaret Fairfield, who offered stiff congratulations that Grace accepted with grace. As evening fell and musicians began to play, Jake led Grace onto the dance floor for their first waltz as husband and wife. He moved with the same patient skill he had shown that first Saturday night, adjusting his steps to accommodate her limp, making her feel beautiful and capable and whole. Happy, he asked as they turned across the floor. Beyond measure, Grace replied, and meant it. The years that followed were filled with hard work and gradual prosperity. The Thornton and Whitmore Cattle Company flourished under their joint management. Grace's financial acumen and Jake's ranching expertise proved to be a formidable combination. Their first child, a son, they named Robert after Grace's father was born in the spring of their second year of marriage. Grace labored through a long night with Ruby and Widow Martinez in attendance, while Jake paced the floor downstairs, wearing a path in the wooden boards. When Ruby finally called him up to meet his son Jake, held the tiny bundle with a tenderness that made Grace's heart overflow. "He looks like you," he said, touching the baby's copper-colored hair. "He has your eyes," Grace countered, seeing gray-blue depths in their son's unfocused gaze. Over the next decade, 3 more children joined their family. A daughter they named Ruby for the woman who had become Grace's closest friend. Twin boys, Henry and William, the latter named for the man whose death had brought Grace and Jake together. The ranch expanded, doubling in size and tripling in profitability. Grace developed innovative accounting systems that other ranchers began to adopt. She also started teaching bookkeeping to young women in Clearwater, passing on her skills to the next generation. Jake's reputation grew as well. He became known as a fair employer and a skilled rancher, someone who combined traditional knowledge with willingness to try new methods. Together they helped transform Clearwater from a struggling frontier town into a thriving community. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children now grown with families of their own, Grace and Jake sat on the porch of the ranch house and looked out over the valley that had become their kingdom. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked. "Coming west, I mean." Everything that happened, Grace thought about the frightened woman who had stood alone on Clearwater Station, abandoned and hopeless. She thought about William Harper, the man she never met, but who had changed her life through his letters and his death. She thought about the years of work and worry and joy that had brought her to this moment. "Not for a single day," she said, taking Jake's weathered hand in hers. "Every hardship led me here to you, to this life. How could I regret the path that brought me home?" Jake lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Grace Thornton, and I love you." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, the same colors that had greeted Grace on her first evening in Montana. The iron rose Jake had forged sat on the mantel inside, a permanent reminder of promises kept and love earned. Grace lived to be 82, Jake to 79. They died within 6 months of each other, having built a legacy that extended far beyond cattle and land. Their children carried on the ranch, expanding it further, their grandchildren scattered across Montana, carrying the Thornton and Whitmore names into new ventures. But it was their great-granddaughter, another Grace, who perhaps honored them most. She became the first woman rancher in Montana to serve on the Territorial Cattle Association Board, citing her great-grandmother's example as proof that intelligence and determination mattered more than gender or physical ability. The Iron Rose was donated to the Montana Historical Society, where it remains on display with a placard explaining its significance. And the letters between Grace Whitmore and William Harper, carefully preserved through generations, are now part of the archives collection on frontier women and the mail-order bride system that brought so many Eastern women west. In the end, what had seemed like Grace's greatest tragedy, being abandoned at a remote train station, had been the doorway to her greatest triumph. She had come west seeking a husband and found instead a partnership, a purpose, and a place where her capabilities were valued more than her limitations. The mail-order bride with a limp had indeed been left stranded at Clearwater Station, but from that abandonment had grown a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes life's hardest moments are merely the beginning of its greatest chapters.